At this point in my Chivalry 2 career, I think the most fun and the games I look forward to the most are the competitive team objective games. And if you've played in one, you already know this, but if you haven't, they're just vastly different from the experience that you get in a traditional 64-player lobby. I'm Strider the Champ, and in today's video, I'm going to talk about the difference between public lobbies and competitive games. And at the end, I'll give you guys some discourse to check out if you're interested in getting involved in the competitive scene. In a public lobby, just by being a mechanically skilled player, you're generally gonna dominate. The majority of players in the lobby are very casual and have very little thought behind their approach to combat. This means you're Sauron from the opening scene of Lord of the Rings, just swatting noobs out of the way left and right. But in a competitive lobby, things change drastically, as every single player in the game is now also strong mechanically. So the days of running into the enemy spawn fighting 5 people are over. I actually have kind of an opinion that in these competitive lobbies, combat skills are almost obsolete. When mechanics are somewhat close in Chivalry 2, fights can take a long time to end, and you have a very small window of time to kill someone before you get mobbed and overwhelmed. I would actually say that if you're a player who belongs in these lobbies, your pure combat skills, they take a big back seat to the more mental aspects of the game, which are awareness, positioning, and decision making. I actually think this is what allows players like myself or Randy to just consistently be at the top of the kill counts. Making quick, calculated decisions on when you see an enemy overextend or they're poorly positioned and they're giving you their back. Making those decisions on who and when to prioritize fights, it's just such a skill, and I think it's kind of what separates sometimes the players at the top or the middle of the board. And I'll admit, but I like to even prioritize the other team's top fraggers. If I see a really strong player engaged in a 1v1, I am immediately crashing that party to get him back to the respawn screen. As players, we spend so much time talking about pure mechanical skill, but the mental aspects of the game, especially at higher levels, are probably the most important part, and I have a theory on this. Playing in first person for hundreds of hours has forced me to consistently train my awareness and make good decisions, and in these events, I think myself and Coach Soder Dave are literally the only players playing in first person. Now, combat skills, I think, are really important to master for these type of events. They're not talked about very much, and that would be target switching and look-offs. Now, target switching, in theory, is pretty simple. You engage with one opponent and then change your attack or your focus to another. Many times, even good players will be so focused on trying to overwhelm you or to land a shot of their own that you're able to squeeze a shot in when you switch your attacks. This works great in group fights where enemies, they need to process just so many things at a time. I actually hit a really nasty target switch in the last Tournament Grounds match if you need an example. Now, look-offs are where you turn your character model to stare at another enemy, but then bring your attack back to the original. So if I'm engaging 2 enemies, one off to my right and one directly in front of me, I may swivel my view to the enemy on the right, begin my attack, and then look back to the enemy in front of me before it lands. Again, especially in fights with multiple opponents and teammates, it's very difficult to process a ton of information at a time, and these little mind games, the mental games that you can play with people, can sometimes be way more effective than things like rainbow drags and 360s. Now let's talk a little bit about archery. And I know people are going to get mad at me for this. That's what the comment section is for. But don't be like the people on Reddit who were reacting to Sun God's competitive weapon tier list and they've never played in a competitive match. So don't be one of those guys. But unless you're Dave or Stepbo, Archer is a massive liability in competitive play. In Tournament Grounds, not one single player out of 60 Chads went Archer. What tends to happen if you have a few Archers is teams, they tend to stick together well in comp. So now your melee fighters are going into battle down a few combatants. Now in a pub, this might not be noticed because a good player can kind of swat a few noobs away while you miss shots in the back. But in a comp lobby, giving a player or 2 advantage in the melee means you probably lost the fight for your team at class selection. Again, as far as I know, there are only 2 players who can run crossbow in a comp lobby and have a real large influence on the game. So unless you're one of those 2, grab a sword or an axe. Now, on the discussion of weapons and classes, virtually anything works in a pub if you're good enough, but in competitive lobbies, there are definitely certain traits and weapons that are favored, and weapon reach becomes a huge priority. This is why you see limits on weapons like the halberd or the two-handed spear. Being able to put out damage from relative safety is just such a huge advantage, especially in packed group fights where a good halberd player can stick to the backside of their team and just dunk overheads into an enemy non-stop. Landing hits or being a pest and draining stamina, both are equally effective. Longer weapons also provide a massive advantage over, say, a one-handed weapon, and that's because it gives you a greater ability to disengage and heal. Just being alive is such a huge advantage to your team. If you're just standing close to melee, you're a deterrent to enemies. And the problem with many one-handed weapons is once you engage, you're all in. However, with something like a great sword, the chances you can pull back behind your team, it's just greater. And banners and resupply points are just so important in comp play because a lot of times players will kind of fight in waves where they push in, they get damage, and they push out. I know that didn't sound too good, but we're going in and out in a lot of these fights. And I think there's a kind of a balance in these things of finding a weapon you like with some reach and quality damage. And it seems players really favor the messers and greatswords for this reason. And you definitely see way less like Dane axes than in a public lobby. I think the shorter range along with the Vanguard health kind of pushes people towards other classes. And speaking of classes, you'll see a lot of knights in these things. I think this is for a few reasons. One, the greater health pool, and two, most players tend to run sword-based weapons, so you're not fighting as much blunt damage as in a pub. Now, while we're talking about blunt weapons, they can be really hard to run since players group up way better in these events than a public lobby, so hit stop, it can be really annoying. However, having 1 to 2 dedicated players with either heavy maces or mauls can just be devastating if they really pick and choose their shots and their targets. What's nice about comp Chiv and Chiv in general is you'll see a lot of comfort picking, and this varies per player. Like, I pretty much universally use the longsword in these things. It has enough reach to let me kind of back out of engagements, and the stabs are just perfect for interrupting enemies and roaming around trying to turn engaged fights and snowball games. And then lastly, before I leave you guys, let's talk about the real MVPs of the comp play, and it's not the guys at the top of the board, but the ones building walls and spike traps. Engineer play becomes just a massively important part of competitive play. Being able to wall off healing stations so that your team can constantly bandage, or just stalling out choke points that allow your team to respawn, it's just such a huge element of the competitive experience, and it takes a very selfless person to perform these roles. All right, guys, I hope this just kind of talk about competitive gave you guys a little bit of insight into how the game changes when you have more quality players in a lobby. Now, I'm going to put in the description a link to both my Discords and the Tournament Ground Discord. I host events every month or so, which they're a great entry into competitive play. And then Tournament Grounds, they'll put you in touch with clans if you want to get even more into competitive play. If you made it this far, hit the sub button, champ out.